In the small town of Briar Glen, where the water tower leaned slightly, to the left like an old man too stubborn to fall, and every porch carried the weight of summers long past, people believed sound was everything. They believed truth lived in voices. They believed silence meant absence. And they believed that Margaret Hale lived in a world without either. Margaret sat on her porch every morning at exactly 8:10, not 8:09, not 8:11, 8:10. Routine had become her anchor in a world that had once shifted without warning. The porch boards beneath her feet were soft with age, worn smooth in the places where she and her husband Daniel had once stood together, watching thunderstorms roll in over the distant hills. She kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers resting against one another, like they were holding something fragile. Sometimes, without realizing it, her thumb would trace the outline of her wedding ring. She had never taken it off. Not when they told her he was gone. Not when they lowered him into the ground. Not in the 40 years since. Her pale blue hearing aids rested behind her ears, delicate and precise. They helped, but they did not restore what she had lost. The wind chimes hanging from the porch roof swayed gently in the morning breeze. She watched them carefully. Once, they had sounded like laughter, bright, carefree. Daniel had hung them there on their 10th anniversary. He had said, his voice warm and teasing, "Now the house will sing to you even when I'm not home." Margaret remembered pretending to be annoyed. "They'll drive me crazy," she had said. But secretly, she had loved them. Now they moved in silence. Or perhaps it was she who had moved away from them. She thought about Daniel most in the mornings. She thought about the way he used to sit beside her with his coffee, his arm resting protectively along the back of the bench. She thought about how safe that had felt, how permanent it had seemed. She thought about the last morning she saw him, how ordinary it had been, how dangerous ordinary could be. Her eyes drifted across the street, to the road, to the sidewalks, to the people who passed without seeing her. They nodded politely sometimes, smiled in that careful way people smiled at the elderly. Kind, distant, temporary. They did not know who she had been. They did not know what she had lost. They did not know what had been taken. And as Margaret sat there, watching the wind move through a world she could no longer hear, she did not think about her silence as an absence. She thought about it as a witness. Because silence, she had learned, did not erase the truth. It preserved it. It gave truth a place to wait. And Margaret Hale had been waiting for a very long time. 40 years earlier, Margaret Hale had been the voice of Briar Glen. Not just a voice, the voice. She sat behind the switchboard in a narrow room that smelled faintly of warm wires and lemon oil, her fingers moving with quiet confidence across rows of blinking lights. "Briar Glen operator," she would say, her voice steady and kind. "How may I direct your call?" People trusted her voice. They trusted the calm inside it. They trusted the certainty. But there was only one voice in Briar Glen that ever made her forget what she was doing. Daniel Hale's. He would call sometimes, even when he didn't need to. She would recognize him before he said a word. She remembered one afternoon in particular. The late sunlight had slanted through the tall window, painting everything gold. The line clicked. She answered automatically. "Briar Glen operator." There was a pause. Then Daniel said softly, "I was hoping it would be you." She smiled, though he could not see it. "You know it's always me." His voice carried that familiar warmth. "I just wanted to hear your voice." She felt her cheeks flush. "You hear it every morning." "It's different when you're talking to me," he said. She lowered her eyes. "Daniel, you're at work." "I know," he admitted. "But I was thinking about you sitting there, connecting the whole town, and I realized something." She leaned slightly closer to the receiver. "What?" He hesitated, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "You're the center of everything here, not the switchboard. You." Her heart stumbled inside her chest. "Daniel." "I mean it," he said. "This town runs because of people like you, because of your kindness, because of your patience." He paused again. "And because of your love." Margaret swallowed. "You're being sentimental." "I'm being honest." She could hear his smile. "I never told you this," he continued, "but the first time I saw you, I knew." "Knew what?" "That I was going to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." Her breath caught. She whispered, "You don't have to try." "Yes," he said gently. "I do, because loving you is the most important thing I will ever do." She closed her eyes, holding his words inside her, protecting them. "You already deserve me," she told him softly. He laughed under his breath. "I hope so, because I don't know who I'd be without you." She remembered answering him in a voice that trembled with truth. "You'll never have to find out." That night, sitting together on their porch, he had taken her hand in his rough, familiar grip. "You know," he said, watching the sunset, "people think love is something loud, something dramatic." She rested her head on his shoulder. "What do you think it is?" He squeezed her hand gently. "I think it's this." She tilted her head. "This?" He nodded. "Waking up every morning and knowing there's nowhere else you'd rather be. Knowing that whatever happens, you'll face it together." He turned to her then, his eyes steady, certain. "I'm not afraid of anything, Margaret. Not storms, not time, not loss." He paused. "The only thing I'm afraid of is a world without you in it." Her eyes filled with tears. She whispered, "Daniel, that world doesn't exist." He smiled. "It better not." She had believed him, with the absolute certainty of someone who had never imagined love could be interrupted. She had believed they were permanent. She had believed love made promises the world would keep. She had been wrong, but she would carry his words long after his voice was gone, long after silence took its place. Because love, she would learn, did not live in sound. It lived in memory, and memory never stopped speaking. The night the water took Daniel Hale began like so many others in Briar Glen, quiet, ordinary, deceptively gentle. Margaret remembered the way the air had felt that evening, heavy, waiting. The sky had turned the colour of old bruises, deep purple and grey, the clouds hanging low enough to make the town feel smaller. Daniel stood at the kitchen window, his hand resting against the frame, watching the distance. Margaret watched him. She knew that look. He was thinking about other people. He was always thinking about other people. Thunder rolled faintly, too far away to be frightening yet, but close enough to promise it would be. "Storm's coming in fast," he said. Margaret dried her hands on a dish towel. "You can't stop a storm," she replied gently. He turned to her. "I can help people through it." Lightning flickered briefly, illuminating his face. Margaret felt something twist inside her chest. A quiet, unspoken fear. She stepped closer to him. "Daniel," she said softly, "you've done enough." He smiled at her, that familiar, reassuring smile that had carried her through half her life. "I'll never be done," he said. Rain began tapping against the windows, slow at first, then faster, more urgent. He reached for his coat. Margaret's voice trembled. "Where are you going?" "The Wilson place," he answered. "Their land sits low. If the dam releases water, they won't have much time." Her heart dropped. Then they should evacuate. "They don't have anywhere to go." He said it simply, as if that explained everything. To him, it did. Margaret stepped in front of him, blocking the door. "Wait until morning," she pleaded. He looked at her, really looked at her. He reached up and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing gently beneath her eye. "I can't," he said. Her voice broke. "You don't know what will happen out there." He smiled sadly. "I know exactly what will happen if I don't go." Tears filled her eyes. She grabbed his hand, holding it tightly, as if she could anchor him to the floor. "Please," she whispered. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers. "Margaret," he said quietly, "everything I am, everything good in me, exists because of you." Her breath caught. "I love you," he continued, "more than anything this world could ever take." She shook her head. "Then stay." His eyes filled with something she could not name: regret, love, acceptance. "If I stay," he said gently, "I won't be the man you fell in love with." Her fingers tightened around his. "You're already that man." He smiled faintly. "I have to deserve you. Every day." Thunder cracked louder now, closer, more violent. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. She buried her face in his chest, listening to his heartbeat, strong, steady, alive. She remembered thinking she would remember that sound forever. He kissed the top of her head. "I'll be back before you know it." She pulled away, searching his face. "You promise?" He hesitated, only for a second, but she saw it. "I promise," he said. He stepped toward the door, then stopped. He turned back to her, as if something inside him refused to leave without saying more. "If anything ever happens," he said softly, "I need you to remember something." Her heart began to race. "What?" He walked back to her, took her hands again. "You are stronger than anything this world will ever put in front of you." She shook her head. "I'm only strong because I have you." He smiled sadly. "No," he whispered. "You're strong because you're you." Lightning flashed again. Rain slammed against the roof now, demanding. He opened the door. Cold wind rushed inside. He stepped out into the storm. Then he turned back one last time. Their eyes met. And in that moment, Margaret felt something she would not understand until years later. It was not fear. It was not dread. It was goodbye. He smiled at her. She smiled back. Because she loved him. Because she believed him. Because she believed promises were stronger than storms. The door closed behind him. Margaret stood there long after he was gone, listening, waiting, believing. But Daniel Hale never came home. And in the years that followed, Margaret would forget the sound of thunder. She would forget the sound of rain. She would even forget the sound of her own voice. But she would never forget the sound of the door closing. Because that was the last sound the world had given her before it took everything away. Mayor Thomas Whitaker came to Margaret's house on a Tuesday afternoon. Margaret saw his car before he reached the porch. Black, polished, out of place against the faded paint and tired wood of her home. She watched him step out slowly, adjusting his coat, looking around with the careful discomfort of a man who did not visit places like this unless he had to. He walked up her steps with rehearsed confidence. She could feel the vibration of his footsteps through the porch boards beneath her feet. He knocked, 3 sharp raps. She opened the door before he could knock again. He smiled the way people smiled when they believed kindness was something they performed. "Mrs. Hale," he said, his lips moving deliberately, exaggerating each word. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Margaret said nothing. She simply watched him. He continued, raising his voice louder than necessary. "We're making improvements to the dam." Improvements. He said the word like it was a gift. She studied his mouth, studied his eyes. She saw no hesitation there, no memory, no apology, only ambition. He gestured vaguely toward the distance. "It will help the town grow." Help the town. The same words, the same lie. Margaret's hands remained still at her sides. He kept talking. "There may be some temporary inconvenience for residents near the lower basin." Temporary. Inconvenience. Margaret thought of Daniel's empty chair, his empty side of the bed. 40 years of silence. He shifted uncomfortably beneath her gaze. Then he said something he did not expect her to understand. something softer, something careless. He muttered, barely moving his lips. She can't hear any of this anyway. Margaret felt the words like a blade, not because of what they meant, but because of what they revealed. He did not see her, not really. He saw her as something already gone. He cleared his throat and raised his voice again. "We just wanted to inform you." Inform. Margaret's eyes drifted past him, to the living room, to the photographs on the wall, her grandchildren. Emma, missing her front teeth, smiling proudly. Jacob holding a fish far too big for his small hands. Little Rose, asleep against Margaret's shoulder. They visited every Sunday. They filled her house with movement, with laughter she could not hear but could still feel. She thought of their small hands in hers, their futures, their lives. She thought of water rising in the dark. She looked back at Whittaker. He was still speaking, still explaining, still lying. She interrupted him, her voice quiet, fragile, but unbreakable. "You said the same thing before." He froze. His smile faltered. "I'm sorry." She stepped forward, her eyes locked on his. "The night my husband died." His face changed. Just slightly, just enough. "That was an accident," he said quickly. Margaret shook her head. She remembered Daniel standing in that doorway. His promise, his love, his last look. "You told the town there was no danger," she said. Whittaker's jaw tightened. "That was 40 years ago." Margaret nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. 40 years of you sleeping at night." She paused. 40 years of him not coming home. He looked away, toward the photographs, toward the evidence of a life that had continued without his permission. "You don't understand how difficult those decisions were," he said defensively. Margaret felt something inside her harden. "My grandchildren play in this town," she said. He said nothing. "They walk these streets." Silence. "They trust this place." His throat moved as he swallowed. She stepped closer, close enough that he could no longer pretend she was small, or weak, or gone. "You took their grandfather from them," she said. Her voice trembled, not with weakness, with truth. "And now," she whispered, "you're willing to take whatever comes next." Whittaker shook his head. "You're confused." Margaret stared at him. She spoke the words slowly, carefully, so there would be no misunderstanding. "No," she said. "I remember." Silence stretched between them, heavy, unforgiving. He turned to leave, then stopped. Without looking at her, he muttered under his breath, "She doesn't know anything." Margaret watched his lips form the words. She felt Daniel's promise echo inside her. "You are stronger than anything this world will ever put in front of you." Whittaker walked down her steps, back to his car, back to his lies. He never looked back. He never saw Margaret's hand curl into a fist at her side. He never saw the decision settle inside her. He never understood. Margaret Hale had lost her hearing, but she had never lost the truth. And this time, she would not let the water take anything else. The Briar Glen coffee shop had not changed in 50 years. The floors still creaked in familiar places. The counter still bore the faint burn mark from a careless pot left too long in 1973. And the windows still looked out over Main Street, where nothing and everything happened. Margaret sat in her usual booth near the back. Her tea rested untouched before her, thin steam rising in quiet surrender. She watched the room the way she always did, carefully, patiently. 2 men entered just after noon. They did not belong. Their suits were too sharp, their shoes too clean. They carried themselves with the careless confidence of men who believed the ground beneath them was already theirs. They sat in the booth behind Margaret. They did not lower their voices. They did not need to. One of them laughed softly and said, "Whittaker says Phase 1 will solve the elevation problem." Elevation problem. Margaret kept her eyes on the window, her body still, her attention absolute. The second man leaned forward. And the residents? The first man shrugged. They'll call it flood risk. Flood risk. Margaret's fingers tightened around her cup. The second man nodded slowly. And once the lower basin clears? The first man smiled. Margaret saw it reflected faintly in the glass. Cold, certain. Then the real construction begins. Construction. He pulled a folded paper from his coat, spread it on the table. Margaret watched their eyes move across it, watched their mouths form the future. Luxury housing along the ridge, he said. Retail near the bridge. Private marina access. Marina in Briar Glen. The second man frowned slightly. What about the current homeowners? The first man's smile never faded. They'll be compensated. He paused, then added quietly, less than market value, of course. Of course. Margaret felt something hollow open inside her. The second man hesitated. And the dam? The first man leaned back, relaxed, confident. Early release creates flood damage. He spoke the next words without emotion. Flood damage lowers property value. He tapped the paper. Lower property value makes acquisition cheap. Cheap. Margaret thought of the small houses along the basin, the Wilson place, the Carter home, the porch where her grandchildren played. The second man asked carefully, "And the town?" The first man laughed softly. "The town will believe what it's told." Margaret felt her heart begin to pound, not with fear, with recognition. The second man leaned closer. "And Whitaker?" The first man's lips curled. "He owns development shares through intermediaries." Silence. Then, "He clears the land. He buys it cheap. He sells it high. Profit." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Daniel's face filled her memory. Daniel walking into the storm. Daniel never coming back. The second man spoke again. "And the people who live there now?" The first man didn't hesitate. "They'll leave." He said it like it was nothing, like they were nothing. Margaret realized then, this was never about safety, never about progress. It was about erasing people, erasing history, erasing lives. The mayor wasn't protecting the town. He was selling it, one flood at a time. The men stood to leave. As they passed her table, one of them glanced at Margaret. His eyes flicked briefly to her hearing aids. He leaned toward his companion and whispered. She didn't hear a word. They walked out, certain, untouched, safe. Margaret remained still. Her tea had gone cold. Outside, the town moved as it always had, unaware, vulnerable, waiting. Margaret stared at her reflection in the window, at the old woman they believed was powerless, invisible, finished. She thought of her grandchildren, their small hands, their trust, their future. She thought of Daniel, his promise, his love, his loss. And in that moment, Margaret Hale understood something with absolute clarity. The mayor wasn't just trying to clear land, he was trying to clear the past. But the past did not disappear. It waited, just like she had. And Margaret Hale was done waiting. What the mayor never understood was this. Margaret Hale had spent 20 years listening for a living, before she lost her hearing, before the storm, before silence settled into her bones. She had been the keeper of voices, and the night Daniel died, she had been at her switchboard. The storm had already begun building when the first calls came in. Farmers asking about weather warnings, store owners checking in on shipments, mothers calling daughters to come home early. Margaret connected them all. Her fingers moved with practiced rhythm, calm, efficient, certain. Then, at 8:17 p.m., one particular line blinked. Mayor's office. She remembered it clearly because the light didn't flicker the way it usually did. It burned steady, demanding. She plugged in. "Briar Glen operator," she said. The voice on the other end was tight, controlled. It was Thomas Whitaker, not yet mayor at the time, but already holding power on the town's infrastructure committee. "Connect me to the dam control station," he said. His voice was lower than usual, not the public voice, the private one. Margaret made the connection, but she did not disconnect her monitoring line. Switchboard operators were permitted to stay briefly to confirm the line was clear. She told herself she was only confirming. The dam operator answered. There was static from the storm. Then Whitaker spoke. "You need to initiate early release." The operator hesitated. "It's ahead of schedule," he replied. "Rainfall projections don't justify full release yet." Whitaker's voice hardened. "Release 30% capacity now." Silence. Then the operator said quietly, "That will flood the lower basin if the rain intensifies." Whitaker answered without pause, "Do it." Margaret felt something cold slide down her spine. The operator tried again. "We should notify the residents." Whitaker's reply came sharp and final. "No notice." The words hung in the line like something alive. "No notice," he repeated. "We can't cause panic." Panic. Margaret's hand tightened on the receiver. The operator's voice trembled. "If something happens," Whitaker interrupted him, "nothing will happen." A pause. Then softer. "Just follow the order." The line went quiet. Margaret remained connected longer than protocol allowed. Her heart was racing. Her instincts were screaming. She wrote the time down in her personal log. 8:19 p.m., early release ordered, no public notice. She told herself it was just a precaution, that nothing would happen, that Whitaker knew what he was doing. She disconnected. Outside, thunder cracked louder. At 9:02 p.m., the first emergency call came through. Water rising. Fast. At 9:14 p.m., Daniel grabbed his coat. At 10:36 p.m., the dam overflowed beyond projected margins. By morning, Daniel was gone. The official report later claimed the release had been necessary due to unexpected rainfall acceleration. The timeline in the public record was adjusted. The early release time shifted. The operator's name never appeared. Margaret read the report over and over. The times did not match what she had written. But she still had her log, her private notebook, kept separate from official records. She had written it in ink, precise, undeniable. The page had yellowed over the decades, but the words remained. No notice. She remembered confronting Whitaker quietly at Daniel's funeral reception. He had approached her with rehearsed sympathy. "This was an act of nature," he told her gently. She had looked at his mouth carefully as he spoke. "Nature doesn't pick up a phone," she replied. His face had gone still, only for a second, but she saw it. Recognition. Fear. He never addressed it again. And over time, as her hearing faded and the town moved forward, people assumed her memories had faded too. They had not. Margaret Hale may have lost the ability to hear the present clearly, but she remembered the past with perfect clarity. The call, the command, the choice. And now, 40 years later, when she learned Whitaker planned another early release, she understood something with terrible certainty. He had done it once. He would do it again. And this time, she still had the record, still had the time, still had the truth, the call no one was supposed to remember. But she had never forgotten. The town meeting was held in the Briar Glen Community Hall. It was the same building where Margaret had attended school plays, the same building where she and Daniel had danced on their 25th anniversary, the same building where the town gathered whenever it needed to feel united. That night, it did not feel united. It felt divided, uneasy, afraid. Margaret arrived early. Her granddaughter Emma walked beside her, holding her arm gently. Emma was 17 now, old enough to understand, old enough to be afraid too. "Grandma," Emma had asked her quietly before they entered, her voice trembling, "you don't have to do this." Margaret had looked at her granddaughter's face, at Daniel's eyes looking back at her through another generation. She had answered simply. "Yes," she said, "I do." Inside, the room filled quickly. Farmers, shopkeepers, families, people who trusted the dam because they had been told to. Mayor Whitaker stood at the front, confident, controlled, certain. He spoke with the practiced ease of a man who had lied so often he no longer felt the difference. "This project represents Briar Glen's future," he said. Margaret watched his lips carefully. Every word, every shape, every lie. "There is no danger to the community," he continued. "No danger. The same promise, the same betrayal." He smiled. "Progress requires trust." Margaret felt Emma's hand tighten around hers. Whitaker continued. "The early release is a precautionary measure, nothing more." Precautionary. Margaret remembered Daniel's coat hanging by the door, still wet, still waiting. Whitaker spread his hands. "You have my word." Margaret stood, slowly. The movement was small, but it pulled the air out of the room. Whitaker saw her. His smile faltered, just slightly. "Mrs. Hale," he said loudly, his voice exaggerated, performative. "Is there something you'd like to say?" Margaret released Emma's hand. She walked forward alone. Each step deliberate, measured. 40 years of silence walking with her. She stopped in front of him, close enough to see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She spoke, her voice thin, but unbreakable. "You said that before." Whitaker blinked. "I'm sorry." Margaret did not look away. The night the dam released early. A ripple moved through the crowd. Whitaker's jaw tightened. "That was different." Margaret shook her head. "No," she said, "it wasn't." He forced a smile. "That was an emergency situation." Margaret reached into her purse. Her hands did not shake. She removed the notebook. Worn, faded, sacred. She held it up. "I was working the switchboard." Whitaker's face began to pale. She opened the notebook carefully, turned to the page she had memorized. She looked at him. Then she spoke the words she had carried for 40 years. "You called the dam operator." Silence fell, heavy, total. Her voice grew steadier. "You told him to release the water early." Whitaker's lips parted. No sound came out. Margaret's eyes burned into his. "And when he asked about warning the town," she paused. The room held its breath. She spoke the words slowly, clearly, so there could be no escape. "You said, 'no notice.'" A gasp broke somewhere in the crowd. Margaret did not stop. She repeated it, louder, stronger. "No notice." Emma covered her mouth behind her. Whitaker's face collapsed. Margaret took one step closer, close enough that only he could see the tears in her eyes. "You didn't warn them," she said. Her voice cracked, not with weakness, with truth. "You didn't warn him." The room erupted. Voices, questions, shock. But Margaret saw only Whitaker. She saw the man who had taken Daniel from her, the man who had lived 40 years with her silence protecting him. Until now. Whitaker tried to speak. "Mrs. Hale, you don't understand," Margaret interrupted him. "I understood perfectly." She placed her hand over her heart. "I heard you." Whitaker whispered desperately. "You couldn't have..." Margaret's voice cut through him like glass. "I heard you say no notice." Silence crashed down again. Final, absolute, irrefutable. In the back of the room, someone said softly, "My God." Margaret turned. She looked at the people she had lived beside her entire life, the people who had thought she was gone, forgotten, finished. She spoke to them, not as a victim, but as a witness. "He knew," she said. Her voice trembled. "And he did it anyway." She paused. Her eyes filled. "He let the water take him." Emma began to cry. Whitaker stood frozen. The truth had finally found him, and for the first time in 40 years, Margaret Hale was no longer silent. They came for Thomas Whitaker on a morning that looked too peaceful for justice. The sky above Briar Glen was pale and open, the kind of sky Daniel had loved, the kind of sky that made promises it did not always keep. Margaret was sitting on her porch when the black sedan pulled up in front of Whitaker's house across the street. She had been awake since before sunrise. She had not slept. Not really. Not in the way people slept when they had nothing left to carry. She watched two men step out of the car, dark jackets, serious faces, purpose in every movement. They walked up Whitaker's front steps, knocked, once, twice. The door opened. Whitaker stood there, smaller than she remembered, older. Fragile in a way, power had hidden from him. They spoke to him. Margaret could not hear the words, but she did not need to. She saw his shoulders fall, saw the moment he understood. It was over. They gave him time to put on his coat, time to become a man again instead of a mayor. When he stepped back outside, his eyes moved across the street and found her. Margaret did not move. She did not look away. He hesitated on the steps. Then, to the surprise of the men beside him, he spoke. His voice carried just enough for her hearing aids to catch pieces, but she read the rest on his lips. He called her name. Margaret. It was the first time he had said her name in 40 years without pretending not to know it. She stood slowly. Her bones ached. Her heart did not. He took a step toward her. One of the men reached for his arm, but Whitaker pulled away. "Please," Whitaker said. The word looked foreign on his lips. Begging did not suit him. Margaret walked to the edge of her porch. The distance between them was no more than 20 feet, but it held 40 years inside it. His face crumpled. "I never meant for him to die," he said. The excuse sounded old, worn, useless. Margaret said nothing. He stepped closer. Desperation stripped away the last of his pride. "It was supposed to be controlled," he said. His voice broke. "I thought there was time." Time. Margaret remembered Daniel standing in that doorway. Daniel believing there was time too. Whitaker's eyes filled. "I have to live with that," he whispered. Margaret studied his face carefully, memorizing it. Not with hatred, but with completion. He swallowed hard. And then he said the one thing he had held on to for 4 decades. The one thing he believed might still save him. "You waited 40 years, he said. His voice trembled. "Why?" Margaret stepped down from her porch. Her granddaughter Emma stood behind her, watching, listening, learning. Margaret stopped a few feet from him, close enough that he could see her tears, close enough that he could see they were not for him. She spoke quietly, her voice fragile, but unbreakable. "I didn't wait for justice." Whitaker's brow furrowed. She placed her hand over her heart. "I waited for courage." He stared at her, lost. She continued. "I was afraid." Her voice cracked. "I was afraid of remembering." She paused. A tear slipped down her cheek. "I was afraid that if I spoke it out loud," she looked directly into his eyes, "it would make it real." Whitaker's face collapsed. Margaret drew a slow breath. "And then one day," she said softly, "my granddaughter asked me what her grandfather was like." Emma began to cry behind her. Margaret's voice trembled. "She asked me why he never came home." Silence wrapped around them. Margaret swallowed. "And I realized." She paused, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I could not let his last moment be a lie." Whitaker's lips trembled. Margaret stepped closer, close enough that only he could hear her next words. Close enough that he would carry them for the rest of his life. "He kept his promise," she said. Whitaker blinked, confused. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "He said he would come back to me." She placed her hand gently against her chest. "And he did." She paused. Her voice broke completely now. "He came back as truth." Whitaker let out a broken sound. The men stepped forward. They took his arms. He did not resist. He could not. As they led him away, he looked back at her one last time. Not as a mayor, not as a powerful man, but as something smaller, something human, something finished. Margaret stood in the morning light. Emma ran to her, wrapped her arms around her. Margaret held her tightly. She could not hear her granddaughter's sobs, but she felt them, and for the first time since the storm. Margaret Hale did not feel silence. She felt peace, because after 40 years, the truth had finally been heard. Months later, the dam still stood, the town still breathed, and Margaret still sat on her porch. The wind chimes swayed. She could not hear them, but she felt their vibration through the wood beneath her fingers. Her granddaughter Emma sat beside her one afternoon. "Grandma," the girl asked softly, "were you scared?" Margaret smiled faintly. She remembered Daniel's voice, his courage, his love. "Yes," she said, "but fear doesn't decide what's right." The girl took her hand. Margaret looked out at Briar Glen, at the town that had forgotten her, at the town that remembered now. They had believed her silence made her weak. They had believed her deafness made her blind. They had been wrong, because Margaret Hale had listened in ways they never understood. And in the end, justice was louder than anything she had ever heard. I hope you liked my story. What did you think of it? I want to hear where you are listening from. Leave me a comment below.